Hello, and welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponderer. I'm Neil Trotter, the host of the show, and we out here in the backyard, enjoying the spring weather. Even though technically, I don't think it's spring yet, right? But spring comes fast where I'm from, and it leaves fast too. But those hot-ass summers are long and humid and mosquito-ridden. So I was like, I'm gonna enjoy the spring while it lasts here, the tolerable warm weather. So might be busting out here with the shades. In fact, you know what? Let's just put the shades on, because there we go. And because we're gonna be talking about some anarchism, and we're gonna be talking about some feminism, and those are two politically charged topics. But you know how we do here in the Black Ponderer. Maybe you don't, but political philosophy is something that I'm passionate about, and I think political philosophy is where the field of philosophy in general, we've kind of neglected that branch, and I think is needed heavily here. And when we talk about our current issues that the world is facing and humanity is facing, like what I was just talking about with the whole summers are too damn long and springs are short, climate change, and let's talk about that from a political, philosophical standpoint. Anyway, so we're going to do that via an examination of this text. Hold it up real close to the camera. Camera's far away from me. Is it called Anarchafeminism? Is by Chiara, Bottici. And this is definitely probably going to be it's definitely going to be a contender for book of the year for me. Best book of the year that I've read. It's a damn good book. The year's just started. We're just in March, but this probably might take the cake already. But we'll see. We'll see. But it's a very good book. So this video is probably going to be pretty damn long. I do make the long videos, but this is going to be pretty long. But don't worry, you can always just stop in the middle of the video and cut out, pause, remember where you left off, come back. I think if you even got an account on YouTube will remember where you left off, and so you can just come back right anytime. Just because the video's long don't mean you gotta watch the whole damn thing. You can watch it in bits and pieces. So just some food for thought. So let me take out my notes, because we got a lot to talk about, because it's gonna be an in-depth discussion here. So this book talks about many things, right? Many topics, which we won't get into because that would be like a 20-hour video, right? Which I'm not going to do. And it's good to leave some room for you to go read it yourself. I like to consider my videos trailers, book trailers. Maybe give you a tease, and then you're like, oh, okay, let me check out this book. So we don't do book summaries here at the Black Ponderer. We just kind of hone in on specific themes the book is talking about, and then I add supplementary commentary via this video, and then the YouTube comments. The other viewers will add their supplementary commentary, and that's how we roll. So one of this thing that the book asks is a question that I'm very interested in, is the question, what does it mean to be a woman? When you ask yourself, what does it mean to be a woman? I've done many videos on feminism, and that question comes up in the comments section. It's like, what do we're changing what it means to be a man, we're changing what it means to be a woman, and these things used to be well known, but now it's fluid, and it's like, well, let's think about what does that even mean, right? And has that definition been the same thing throughout the history of humanity? Yeah, of course not, right? And, right. And then a lot of times I'll go in the comments section, and they'll ask me well, you don't know what it means. And it's not just a woman. Let's say, what does it mean to be a man, right? And of course, you can go through the whole well, a man has a penis and a woman has a vagina, and you could just do it like that. Or you can go more physiological. Women have estrogen and men have testosterone, and that's it, Or, you could get more social about it, or more behavioral, like, well, men are dominant, violent, they're aggressive, women are more subordinate, kind, compassionate. It's like, where did we get these ideas from, right? And do we really even know the answers to these questions? And I'm very interested in asking, what does it mean to be a human being? I don't think we're at humanity in general. We don't have any idea, which is kind of sad because that's who we are, right? But we don't even know who we are, and so when we try to question and try to ask questions about who really are we? Are these definitions that we have, do they really hold true? Oftentimes we get attacked, and it's kind of sad that we get attacked when we're just trying to discover, well, what does it really mean to be a human being, and how we understand humanity. Is that really helping us, or is that hurting us, or is that true really, or where do these ideas come from? And we don't even bother examining these things, but this book does. Right? So I would like to let's get into it. Let's read some quotes from the book. Okay. So I'm going to start here. This is page 3. Right. This is the second paragraph, the 4th line. While other feminists from the left have been tempted to explain the oppression of women on the basis of a single factor, or have imprisoned women's liberation into the framework of a narrow understanding of womanhood, right? Anarchist, so, okay, like I said, we're talking about feminism and anarchism, okay? Anarchists have always been clear in arguing that in order to fight patriarchy, we have to fight the multifaceted ways in which multiple factors, economic, cultural, racial, political, sexual, etc., converge to foster it. Including, we might say, that the very factors that lead us to privilege certain notions of womanhood over others. Okay, well, that's an important point that's made here. First of all, the statement, anarchists have always been clear in arguing that in order to fight patriarchy, you got to fight multifaceted factors. I don't know about that, right? Because I know it took me a while to come around to the anarchism as a philosophy, because I've known anarchists who were definitely not clear. In fact, there was a lot of anarchists that I've met who were very patriarchal and sexist, and thought the multifaceted approach was not the thing to do. But anarchism as a philosophy, if you're looking at the philosophical understanding of anarchism, if you really delve into deep with it, I can see what the author is saying here. Look, anarchism is about looking at oppression as multifaceted. That is more than just classism or statehood, right? Or, you got to deal with race and gender and all these other things, right? And you might say, well, how so? That's what we're going to delve into. So let me read you this page. Page 7, 4th to the last line. More than a label to classify text or people, or a philosophical political program to be written once and for all, anarchism is a method in italics. It's a method, okay? So what is anarchism? Is it a social economic system like socialism or communism or capitalism? No, right? It isn't even just a philosophy, right? It isn't an ideology. It can be those things, but it's more than that, right? It's a method. It's a methodology, right? So it's a way of application, right? How so? I'll continue reading. One that questions all forms of hierarchy and therefore invites us to investigate, okay? The way in which they mutually reinforce each other. So we're questioning hierarchy, but not just hierarchy of government, also hierarchy of gender and sex, right? When we talk about womanhood and we're well, some kinds of woman are valid and some kinds are not. You gotta meet this criteria to be a woman, but if you don't meet this criteria, then you're lesser than. Then you're not actually a woman, right? Or you're not actually a man, right? If you don't meet these criteria. That's anarchism too, questioning whoa, wait a minute. What is this based off of? who are we, like, who's the judge of this, right? Are these ways of deeming this is a woman, this isn't a woman? Are they discriminatory? Are they oppressive? Are they actually helping the humanity move forward? And that's anarchism too, right? So now we're already beginning to see like feminism and anarchism together in this anarcha-feminism type of methodology. All right, let me go here to page 16. Yes. And this is the second paragraph at the end of the fourth line. It is only with the emergence of a worldwide capitalist system that the gender binary of masculine men versus feminine women became so hegemonic worldwide. This does not mean that sexual difference did not exist before capitalism, nor does it imply that we should indulge in the nostalgia of a gender fluid past. Okay, yeah, let's not get it twisted, and that happens sometimes, but I'm glad that the author is clarifying that. Like, look, she's not saying that patriarchy didn't exist before capitalism, and she's not saying like, oh, before capitalism everything was all hunky-dory. She's not saying that. What the author is saying is it simply means that taking note of the historically situated nature of the current gender regime, and in particular of the fact that binary gender roles were not as universally accepted as the primary criteria by which to classify bodies as they are today. Okay? So modern colonialism and capitalism made the mononuclear bourgeois family, oh, that word bourgeois, you hear that with the whole socialist communist crowd, but it's true. With its binary gender roles hegemonic, while it endowed the modern sovereign state with a formidable bureaucratic apparatus able to inscribe that gender binary on us through state ID, passports, demography, and healthcare systems, among others. So, what she's saying is this current idea, the accepted, like very popular idea of womanhood and manhood, the traditional. Well, I was talking about men are aggressive. Men have penises. Women have vaginas. Women are compassionate, supportive, but they're subordinate. That's how they're supposed to be. This idea is what props up states and what feeds into statehood. It feeds in the bureaucracy of state power, right? That's what she's saying, right? And we need to understand this. Like, let's look at these definitions. Are these definitions actually helping us become more human, or like understanding what it means to be human, or are they just feeding into like oppressive powers? I would say it's the latter. So what does it mean to be a woman? Well, let me give you a teaser, and then we'll break that down further. This is page 19. This is the fourth paragraph. We should be immediately clear that when we say women, we are not speaking about some supposed object, about an eternal essence, or even less so about a pre-given object. Indeed, to articulate a specifically feminist position while maintaining a multifaceted understanding of domination, we need a more nuanced understanding of womanhood. By drawing insights from feminist readings of Spinoza's philosophy, Spinoza, popular philosopher, of the unique substance, and from an ontology of the trans individual, we will argue that bodies in general, and women's bodies in particular, must not be considered as objects given once and for all, but rather as processes. Okay? We are not things, we are relations. Women's bodies are bodies in plural because they are processes that are constituted by mechanisms of affecting and associating that occur at the intra, supra, and the infra-individual level. To give just a brief example of what we mean here, think of how our bodies come into being through an inter-individual encounter, how they are shaped by a supra-individual forces, such as their geopolitical locations, and how they are made up by intra-individual bodies, such as the air we breathe, the food we eat, or the hormones one may take. And in their turn, think of how such infra-individual bodies connect us with supra-individual ecosystems, modes of production, and structures of reproductions. I like that. I really like that. The idea is, look, we're processes. We are affected by the people we meet. We're affected by the locations we live in, right? And we're affected by the physiological processes that happen between not just within our bodies, but outside of our bodies. This interrelation, this dialectic, if you will. You know, like, for example, you breathe air, but if you're breathing polluted air, that's going to mess you up, right? So it's all processes, right? And I skip down to the last paragraph here on page 20. When women's bodies are theorized as processes, as sites of a process of becoming that takes place at different levels, we can speak about women without incurring the charge of essentialism or culturalism. As we will see in this monist ontology, there is no place for the opposition between sex, nature, and gender, culture, an opposition that has plagued so much of the feminist debates in the West, because there is no place for a body-mind dualism and for nature to be conceived as static and inert, and thus opposed to an always changing nurture. So there's a critique here of feminism, right? This obsession with nature versus nurture, and this kind of lack of acknowledging that nature and nurture blend together, right? and that includes like the mind and the body. Like, the mind is separate from the body. Well, is it really? And this feeds into the whole like different ways of interpreting womanhood, where womanhood becomes exclusive. By adopting this trans-individual ontology, we can also situate the concept of woman outside of a hetero or cis-normative framework, and thus use the term in such a way that it includes all types of women: feminine women, masculine women, AFAB women. AFAB, I think that's all females assigned at birth women, and AMAB women, all males assigned at birth. So now we're acknowledging the difference between sex and gender, right? Where, you know, just because you're assigned a certain sex at birth doesn't mean you that correlates with the gender that you identify as, right? So the author's even including those people, those situations as part of womanhood, right? And then the author continues: lesbian women, bisexual women, trans women, cis women, asexual women, queer women, and so forth and so on. In sum, women come to encompass all bodies that identify themselves and are identified through the always changing narrative of womanhood. Always changing narrative of womanhood, right? A definition that's always changing. I like that. And then I skip down 3 lines. Developing the concept of women as processes also means going beyond the individual versus collective dichotomy. If it is true that all bodies are trans-individual processes, then the assumption that there could be such a thing as pure individual, separate, or even opposed to a given collectivity is at best a useless abstraction and at worst, a deceitful fantasy. Okay, so this is another important thing that's like a theme here at the Black Ponderer. It is the individual versus the collective, where, like, well, is there really that much of a difference between the two, right? You know, in many videos I argue like, well, the collective is the individual and the individual is the collective. Like, we kind of put too much emphasis on the individual, and we don't like acknowledge that, you know, a person is an individual because of the collective that the individual is a part of, right? The individual doesn't do things on their own, right? The individual do things, you know, based off of the collective that the individual is in, right? And that's important to understand, right? And we'll get into more why as we read through this book and talk about it. So this is page 73. This is the second paragraph, the end of the 4th line. Life is not the compartmentalized being we have become accustomed to conceive through modern specialization, but a unity that constantly pulsates through difference. This is the reason why anarchism is not a blueprint for the future, the story of a revolution to come or an ironclad program to be carried out under all circumstances. Anarchism is a living force in the affairs of our life, a force constantly creating new conditions, right? So one would ask, what is anarchism? It's like, well, it depends on where we're at and who we're talking about and how we want to get to where we want to go, right? It's a methodology that rejects illegitimate hierarchies, but how is that rejected and how that rejection is implemented? Well, it depends. And so that dependence is based off of the idea that life is not about being a compartmentalized being, right? Life is about interacting with all beings, right? So it's going to depend, right? And we reiterate here on page 84, being a man or a woman is not an identity, but a social relation. And then we keep going here on page 86. This is the third line. A patriarchal society is oppressive for everybody, despite harming some more than others, precisely because nobody can be free on their own. And this is something we tend to forget. Patriarchy is not just a women's issue. Right? Skip down 3 lines. Anarchafeminism does not mean that women should take the place occupied by privileged white men, but that they should fight to radically subvert the logic of patriarchal oppression, where sexism, racism, classism, statism, heterosexism, and other systems of oppression reciprocally reinforce one another by purporting a politics of domination. This has never been more apparent than today. In a globalizing world where diverse forms of oppression and exploitation are increasingly bound with global capitalism. The obsession with the individual is part of that whole fueling of oppressive systems like hypercapitalism or like patriarchy. Right? The individual is more important than the collective, or like strong individuals make a collective, right? And the collective is depends on the individual. That's true, but the individual also depends on the collective. And leaving that out is what fuels these oppressive systems, right? So that's what's being said there. It's this culture of domination. Okay, let me read you this from page 93. This is the second paragraph. The specific contribution of queer theory within this field of operation lies in its questioning of the boundaries of such sexual and gender identities, and thus inviting us to resist the process of subjectification that they produce. What is specifically queer about queer theory, therefore, is that it is itself an open-ended process aimed at critiquing those hegemonic social structures by which certain subjects are rendered normal and natural through the production of perverse and pathological others. As such, queer critique is directed at questioning all boundaries and processes of normalization via naturalization, and should remain an open-ended process that does not stop at sexual and gender identities, but also looks at their intersections with other normativizing processes, such as racial, class, and imperial epistemologies. So yeah, we're just continuing our thought process here about the ways in which our current thinking props up oppressive powers, right, or discriminatory powers. When we assume variance or difference, like if you're different or you vary, that's perverse or pathological or not normal. You close the door on different ways of being, like you close the door on different ways of existing, and different ways of being, different ways of existing. That's part of human being. That's part of the human animal, and so there's a restriction of the possibilities of the human existing, and restricting human progress. But the reason why this is the case is because a lot of oppressive systems like capitalism and patriarchy and various state powers, they are founded off of these very restrictive ways of thinking. And if you start thinking outside of those mentalities, right, the powers that be, those restrictive powers, will lose their power because it's founded off of those ways of thinking. This is page 94, second paragraph. Reclaiming queerness as a futuridity for Jose Esteban Munoz, yeah, Spanish is not the language I speak. Munoz, for instance, queerness is not an identity to choose in the present, but rather that thing that makes us feel that this present is not enough, that something is missing. As a consequence, queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. So we're talking about queer theory now, which is an offshoot of feminism. And so we have to think about, like, well, what is queer theory? And even as developing and maturing and becoming more involved, right? Where it's not only about like gender inequality, it's about like, well, what does it mean to be a human, right? And there are different ways of being human. And when we think about like the ways that we don't allow people to be human, what does that do, right? And who benefits from that discrimination and oppression, right? And how does that hurt humanity overall? Right? But let me continue. Munoz's perspective on queerness as a futuridity and not as an already given identity, one can claim, is very close to the spirit of Judith Butler, fundamental insight on the performativity of gender. Queerness is a performativity because it is not being but a doing and towards a future. And I put in my notes here, this is akin to the anarchist idea that the present is the future. Act now in the way you want to be the change you want. So gender is a performance, but not like it's not like theater, right? It's deeper than that, which, the philosopher Judith Butler talks about. They're acting in the way that they are, right? And so that's how gender is expressed. It isn't like something, it isn't just like restricted to like how you're born. How gender is expressed is through the way you perform in the world, right? And anarchism, when you get to the theory of anarchism, the philosophy, the same way. Like, you want the world to be a certain way. You don't want to see these illegitimate hierarchies dictating everything and oppressing everybody, right? So you act in a way that challenges those oppressive hierarchies, like mutual aid or direct action. These are ways of performing that directly challenge these illegitimate hierarchies, and in that way you are expressing who you really are, right? And where you want to be this future state, this futuridity, which is what the author is bringing up here. But let me continue. Page 95, 7th line. Gender is not a performance that a priori subject elects to do, but gender is performative in the sense that it constitutes as an effect the very subject it appears to express, okay? So, see, that's the thing that we got to focus on. That sometimes people who read Judith Butler, they kind of miss the mark on that, where like, what are you saying? You're saying like, I'm an actor or something, or I'm like a theater performer? It's like, no, what we're saying is that gender is performative in the sense that it constitutes and affect the very subject it appears to express, okay? And I put in my notes here, the future is created by the present actions. What we do now creates the future. So when we talk about queerness, for instance, how a queer person identifies is how they perform, right? Or how they live in society through their actions. So they're literally creating ways of being, right? They're creating human existence in that way. All people like perform in this way, right? It's just like queer people perform in this variance, this different way that's accepted, that has been accepted in, by the normal social standards, accepted social standards, right? But let me continue reading here. It is compulsory performance in the sense that acting out of line with heterosexual norms brings with it ostracism, punishment, and violence, not to mention the transgressive pleasure produced by those very prohibitions. We can therefore see where the convergence between anarchism and queer theory potentially lies. They both work with a manifold understanding of domination and with a commitment to critically engage with it. And so let me skip down to the last paragraph. This is the end of the 8th line. If we push queer theory to its logical extension, we cannot avoid meaning ecology. Right. And that's a huge theme here in the Black Ponderer. Reality, existence is ecological, right? Reality is an ecology, right? Independence is an illusion. Like nobody is independent. We're all interdependent, radically interdependent. And queer theory is what the author is saying is, look, queer theory states that point blank, right? And so does anarchism, right? And so this is where the book gets really good. So now we're going to get really deep. Okay, are you ready? I'm just going to read several quotes here. And yeah, we're going to get deep. This is actually like a summary of Spinoza's philosophy, but it's like a feminist reading of Spinoza's philosophy. Okay, so here we go. This is page 120, the second line of the third paragraph. The human body is not a kingdom within a kingdom, but just a particularly complex body which is made by a number of other bodies which are inserted into a network of bodies that affect each other in multiple ways. Okay? That's what we've been talking about, right? But we're reiterating. I skipped down the line. The human body can never be viewed as a final or finished product. It is in a constant interchange with its environment and other bodies that can also compose and decompose it. The porosity of the human body is a condition of both its life, because the human body, being a particularly complex one, requires a great many other bodies by which it is, as it were, continually regenerated, and its eventual death, because it can encounter bodies that are more powerful than it is and can thus eventually destroy its integrity. The human body does not therefore occupy any a priori special position in this ontology, but it is just one individuality that is mutually originated with all other individualities. Properly speaking, it exists only in these relations. All individual things exist only as consequences of the existence of other things, of other individual things, with which they participate in an infinite network of connections. Okay, so that's what we were talking about before, right? Individuals don't exist in isolation, right? Individuals only exist by collectives, right? The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, right? All of these things depend on not only other people, but other things, right? Like the air depends on like planet Earth and the atmosphere atmospheric processes of planet Earth, but it also depends on the stuff that humans do, right? We oftentimes pollute the air, and et cetera, et cetera. What the water you drink might come from a pipe that's been treated by a water plant or like utility company, and that involves all types of processes. And that whole thing is this complex situation, and you need water to survive, right? And so on and so forth. You can keep going on this train of thought, and it's really true. And we kind of deceive ourselves into thinking, we just do everything by ourselves. I mean, that's just so far from the truth, right? But let me continue reading here. Notice here, this also implies that causality must not be understood in the sense of a linear succession of events, but rather as a multiplicity of connections between individuals, which are made up of simpler and more complex individuals, all causally related. Every individual is thus constantly composed and decomposed by other individuals, with which it individualizes through a process that involves both the infra-individual and supra-individual levels. So it's not this linear process. It's like this multiple chain, because, you know, like, let's keep going with that example. You breathe air, but you don't just need air. You also need water, right? But you don't just need water. You need food, right? I mean, like, just if you just take those things by themselves, like, that's a very complex, like, multiple, like, non-linear dependence on your existence, or like you depending on the existence of those things happening, which is what I should say, right? But it doesn't stop there, right? Because you need more than food, water, and air, right? You also need love, right? You need, like, quality relationships, right? So that's a whole complex thing. You know, if you don't have those quality relationships, you can get mentally ill, like, you can get emotionally distraught, right? I mean, those are needs of survival as well. And think about all the interconnections and interdependencies that those things involve. But let me keep going here. I skipped down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines. This trans-individual ontology questions the traditional notion of individual, etymologically understood as what cannot be divided within itself, and pushes us to either abandon the notion of individuality altogether or to reframe it on radically different terms. And it is in order to render this novelty, as well as the complexity of the mechanisms that come to make up any individuality, individuality must be understood as trans-individuality, right? Which is just to say, like, look, the collective is the individual is the collective. Like, one is not more important than the other, right? That's just to say that the book does use the word trans-individuality a lot, which is, you know, that's an important term to use to express the situation. But let me continue, right? This does not mean that individuals disappear. Okay, she's not saying that. Don't get it twisted. She's she's saying that individuals don't matter. Like, I don't have individuality. Like, I'm only a collective. I don't matter as an individual. No, she's not saying that. She's not saying that. Okay, what she's saying is that in the strong sense of the term, only individuals really exist. Okay. The substance is not something that transcends or underlines the multiplicity of singular things, but an infinite process of production of multiple individuals, whereas individuals, being all different and all causally dependent, are the necessary existence of the substance. We come to the striking conclusion that the substance is nothing other than individuals themselves. So she's saying, like, look, no, individuals, that's all there is, but individuals, plural, right? There's lots of individuals, and it's not just individuals, plural. It's like individuals that are within a process of other individuals, right? We're kind of like all functions of other individuals, as in we're like individual functions, you know, f of x equals some equation, some formula, like, we're a function that accepts other individuals, and then we spit out other effects or causes or influences, right, that affect other individuals. But we are also the functions that other individuals accept and spit us out into new processes. So it's this trans individuality that goes on, which is really awesome to think about, like, to frame it in that way. But I think that's a true way of thinking about it. But let me keep going. This is page 123, 10th line. Emphasis on the trans-individual nature of individuality with an emphasis on the uniqueness of each individuality. We are trans-individual bodies not because we are all the same, but precisely because of the unique nature of the relations that make each process of individualization possible. Right, so again, just think about, you know, back in the math class when you learned about your functions and you had your f of x equals your y, right? So you're the function, right? And you take in other individuals and you spit out causes and effects, which are the y's, right? Let's say, but then you have to understand that you are also a y. So you are, and you're an x, right? So inserted into other people who are functions. So you're somebody's ex. you're also somebody's arguments into a function, right? That gets spit out into an output, right? And that's a beautiful thing, right? And so I would say, like, you maybe think of it like that. I mean, we're kind of getting into like a differential equations type of a way of thinking, which, you know, mathematically you can kind of like look at that and be like, yeah, that makes sense to me. Because you can describe many things about reality through differential equations. And so that, you know, this is kind of what's being said here on a philosophical level. But anyway, let me skip down 6 lines. Think of how our bodies are composed and decomposed by the food that traverses it. We are constantly processing solids and liquids, by which in turn we are being processed. Similarly, we are constantly composed and decomposed by the molecules that we breathe in and out of our bodies, which connect us with an infinite network of other individualities, including the rainforests on the other side of the globe or the oceans that store carbon dioxide. But also at the infra-individual level, when we eat a salad, it is actually processed by the bacterial microbes in our digestive ecosystem, and it is thus properly described as an encounter between 2 sets of infra-individuals inside the more general trans-individual body of a human being. So, you know, we were just talking about this. We're just like, think about all the processes that occur that you are involved in, which you do to survive, right? And then just breaking it down here. We mentioned food and molecules, but keep in mind that the same holds for thoughts. So it's not just physical, it's mental. As individuals, we are the result of all the modes in the attribute of thinking that we constantly encounter, be they the book you are reading or the phone conversation you had this morning. As we have seen, this is because the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things, since ideas are nothing but affirmations of the body. Thinking ceases here to be the privilege of the human species. The processual nature of bodily composition is not a peculiarity of human bodies, although the latter do exhibit a particularly complex nature and thus require many other individuals for their own survival. All bodies are created by encounters between bodies that modify both the body that encounters and the body encountered, such as their effects, that is, their capacity to act or being acted upon, and thus to increase or lose power. And I'll just keep going here. This is page 125, 4th line. So rather than striving for depriving others of their power, individuals strive to persist in their being by forming associations that enable them to maintain a certain form of equilibrium. It is a paradoxical form of altruistic egoism, or egoistic altruism, for if you prefer, or where striving to persevere in its being does not mean defending against other individuals, but keeping an equilibrium literally through them. Okay, so yeah, it's talking about how you know, existence isn't just about like domination or survival of the fittest, which is kind of this social Darwinist like misinterpretation of Darwinism. This, you know, it's about dominating and like big fish, little fish, and dog eat dog. It's like, no, actually, we are constantly supporting each other. Right? You know, power is constantly distributed equally, and that's the way that life persists. Right? It isn't like a domination that occurs. Right? It is a maintenance of an equilibrium, and that's how that's how life continues to continue. Right? This is page 127, last paragraph, 4th line. Human beings are nothing but particularly complex individuals resulting from movements of attraction and repulsion between more or less complex individuals. In other words, they are not given entities, but rather processes, webs of affective relations which are never given once and for all. This is the sense in which Spinoza's radical statement that desire is the very essence of the human must be interpreted. Defined as an appetite of which we are conscious is not just a feature of human beings, it is much more radically what creates them and what does so through a process of constant individuation that is trans-individual in nature. So I really like this feminist reading of Spinoza's philosophical thought. It's pretty cool. But here we go on page 130. This is the last paragraph, third line. Whenever our body encounters another body, which can be a simple one, like a glass of water, or a more complex one, like another human being, a change in its own constitution will occur. It is in this sense, and in order to keep together what happens both at the infra-individual level and at the supra-individual level, that the notion of trans-individuality becomes particularly helpful. Our bodies are always necessarily bodies in plural, because their individuality is always and inevitably a form of trans-individuality. We are all born from other bodies, and since birth we are being constantly transformed by encountering other bodies, while continuously affecting them in our turn. The concept of trans-individuality is meant to signal that we exist as a complex network of relations as well as our processual nature. And we're just like saying the same thing in different ways to drive in the point, which is important to do, that we exist because other people exist. And we continue to survive because of the infinite processes that enable us to survive. And so in that way, is there really a such thing as independence? Not really. Right? And the way we understand individuality is not the most correct way. The way we prop capitalism and patriarchy and those social standards that we accept in our society. But here we are on page 132. This is the second paragraph, the end of the sixth line here. If everybody is trans-individual by definition, then we can no longer conceive of the relationship between individuals and society according to usual categories, such as the part and the whole, as in Aristotelian models, or the founders and the founded, as in European social contract theories. What these two very different models have in common is that they take individuals, whether single societies or single persons, as a starting point for philosophizing, and not as effects of it. Philosophies of the trans individual are attempts to move beyond this false alternative by asking the question of how individuals themselves come into being in the first place. So yeah, we really do need to reconsider current philosophies that are very popular, Western philosophies that kind of prop up the individual as the ultimate thing that we need to be concerned about. Whereas, like, well, hold on a minute, like, we have to remember that the individual is a result of many processes outside of the individual, right? Or like maybe even say like the individual is never outside any other individual, right? And so like this egoism needs to be changed. And here we are on page 141. This is the second paragraph, the end of the fourth line. Once we get rid of the two twin assumptions that being is always individuated, being and that individuals are the staple entities presupposed by classical logic and metaphysics, then the very opposition between ontology, a discipline devoted to reflect on the logos of being, and history, the discipline of the becoming, disappears. Both become part of a more general series of reflections on the process of individuation, getting rid of that assumption, this obsession of the individual and rejection of like how the collective contributes to the individual. This is page 144. There's a 14th line. Only by taking our skin as a definitive impenetrable boundary are we able to see our bodies as discrete selves. Our bodies are rather more accurately described as a mass of interacting cells, a mass that also includes a variety of bacteria, viruses, and countless genetic fragments that come from outside the boundaries of our skin. And yet, we keep considering the skin cells as the definitive boundaries. From a Spinozist perspective, this may well be due to the fact that human consciousness is a figment of imagination, a necessary illusion derived from the fact that human beings are conscious of their appetites but unaware of their causes. And so they think in terms of final ends and attribute the same type of thinking to all creatures around themselves without realizing how much of that picture is inadequate. Right? We do that, don't we? We don't really have a strong grasp on like eternity or like infinity or like countless possibilities, which kind of like that's kind of what reality is composed of, infinities. Right? Or we like to think of ends, but we don't like to think. It's hard for us to, particularly like Western thought, it's hard for us to consider like things constantly in motion, even though we're not directly involved with them, but they equally impact us in these very powerful ways. Right? It's true. But let me continue reading. If we adopt a trans-individual philosophy, there is no reason for looking only or primarily at the individuals defined by the boundaries of the skin. So this is page 146, 7th line here. Even from the point of view of genetics, immunology, evolution, anatomy, and physiology, it is now clear that we are not, and we have never been, individuals, right? If you look at those fields, you'll see like, oh, well, like the processes that create human beings don't stop at the end of our, like, at the end of our skin, right? Rather, we are all more like lichens. That is, beings whose life is strictly dependent on the symbiosis with their environment and with the bodies that inhabit our bodies. Studies made possible by the new technologies have not only revealed a microbial world of much deeper diversity than previously imagined, but also depicted a world of complex and intertwined relationships, not only among the microbes, but also between microscopic and macroscopic life. And this is page 148, the second to last line of the first paragraph. Every being strives to persist in its being, not despite others, but through others. Right? And this is what they're talking about, the trans nature of the individual. And then I skip down 9 lines. Our bodies must be understood as holobians. Anatomical, physiological, immunological, and developmental functions evolved in shared relationships of different species. Yeah, we just got to start thinking like that because, our scientific fields are continually revealing this is the true nature of reality. Right? But at the same time, right? Just to go back to the notion of, look, we're not saying that the individual doesn't matter, and we're also not saying that definitions don't matter, right? That, everything is a kind of like oneness. I mean, in one way, everything kind of is a oneness, but in another way, it's not, right? So there is a uniqueness. There is a variance. Diversity is both an illusion but it's not an illusion, right? And so now we're getting into the whole dialectical type of thinking. So let me read you page 152. This is the top of the page. The fear is that by questioning all boundaries, we may end up in a night where the cows all equally look gray. Against this fear, we can respond that questioning boundaries does not amount to eliminating them, and thus to eradicate distinctions. Within a philosophy of transindividuality, there is space to add enough determinations to each transindividuality in order to be able to distinguish between them. However, they will be determinations and distinctions within an ecocentric egalitarianism that does not allow any being ontological superiority over others. So it is possible to both have distinctions, but these distinctions aren't hierarchical, right? They don't oppress or discriminate, they don't enforce their power onto others in oppressive ways, right? So you can have distinctions that aren't oppressive, right? That's all that's being said here. Humans have enjoyed such a special place in the great chain of being for too long, and they will not easily accept any view that questions that supremacy. among the philosophical assumptions that guarantee their enthronement on the top of the scala naturae. I think that's Latin. The body-mind dualism has been particularly effective. Humanism thrives on body-mind dualism because the latter justifies a hierarchy of being where those endowed with a soul, mind, psyche can be said to be ontologically superior to the bodies that are considered to lack them. Spinoza's radical monism shatters that humanist hubris at its very foundations, while still being able to articulate a trans-individual philosophy that can distinguish between different individualities. So again, yeah, we're talking about getting rid of illegitimate hierarchies, and that is, we can do that by breaking out of our oppressive ways of thinking, like mind-body dualism, right? This separation of the mind with the body. You don't have to think like that, because science tells us otherwise. The mind depends on the body depends on the mind. They're interconnected, interrelated in such an extreme, radical way that, is there really a difference between them? Well, that you can distinguish them. You can have different distinctions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are absolutely individual substances that oppose each other. But by thinking in this opposition, this dualistic opposition way, right, that legitimize hierarchies that oppress. Okay, don't be alarmed. I just moved because the sun was getting too aggressive. You know, hopefully that also helps with a little noise. Might not, but might pay my notes. Okay, so as we continue with this thought process of trans-individualism, the thing is, because we're always in a process, we're constantly in processes. You know, we're not just static states, we're constantly in change or in flux. So who we are is always in change, right? So in this way, like, nurture is not nature. Like, let's say, like, you know, the way you're brought up isn't the way you always are, or the way that we've been conditioned is not like the way that things are all the time. Like, you know, and so I'm getting at the way that we as a society, we understand things like womanhood and manhood and how these things have been accepted. Ideas about society, social norms, right? We look at these things as if, like, well, they've always been the case. But it's like, well, you know, they've just been the case because we've been conditioned as a society to believe that they have been the case, right? And that idea hasn't always been the case. That conditioning hasn't even always been the case, right? And, you know, don't mistake that conditioning for nature, right? So it just opens the door, or opens the idea that what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a human being? These are things that we're still trying to understand, right? And you might say, like, well, we already know what that is. And if you start changing it, the idea, you're just changing society. And you're changing the way things are. And that's bad. It's like, well, no, it's not, right? Because we're always changing. You know, change is a thing that's part of nature, right? So look, I'll explain further with some quotes here. This is page 163. What we have here is, this is the second paragraph. Life stories imply an entire trans-individual process of storytelling, which must also be the result of the encounters between the stories that we tell ourselves and those that we are told. Between the stories we recognize ourselves in and those we do not. Between the narrative plots that we consciously fabricate and those mythologies that we unconsciously reproduce and over which we have little mastery. And it is by putting together all the stories that we can associate with the term woman that we respond to the question, what does it mean to be a woman? So this is when we're talking about, like, it's not just the body, it's also the mind. And there's mental processes. And we're not just talking about neurological processes, we're talking about, like, you know, in the mind, the ideas, right? And these things change too, and these are affected and constantly changed, right? And so when we talk about what does it mean to be a woman, right, that changes, right, over time, right? And that's something that is part of reality. We as individuals are also narratives. I skip down the line. Narratives circulating in that sphere and deposited in our social unconscious are not just stories. They are constitutive of what we are in general and as a sex being in particular. This is page 164, the end of the fourth line. The body is not an inert matter or an essence to which we can attribute fixed, immutable properties, such as certain types of genitalia or hormones. Rather, the body in general, and women's bodies in particular, are relational processes. I do appreciate how she just keeps reiterating this concept, because it's a complicated concept. So I like to do the same. This is the second to last line of page 166. To those who argue that another world is possible, we should reply that another world is always in the making, in as much as different ways of being a woman are constantly being disclosed to us. Right? So yeah, it's like constantly changing, right? Ways of being are constantly being discovered to us, right? That said, challenging established patterns takes time, and it is particularly hard to accept ways of individualizing as a woman when they question long-established views of what a woman should look like. State institutions provide a crucial stabilizing factor in as far as most of them implement and police gender according to the male-female binary. That is not the whole story, though, because the worst tyrant, as Emma Goldman reminds us, anarchist philosopher, is not outside but inside ourselves. Artistic practices can be particularly useful in addressing both tyrants by providing challenges to hegemonic views in ways that connect critique with emotional attachment. They are often a particularly effective space for renegotiating our imaginal beings. And I skip down 3 lines. We use art, in quotations, here in a very broad sense to denote all sorts of encounters or objects that can work as such an illumination. Yeah, and now we're getting into the part where different ways of being, you can see them as art forms. And this is where we're talking about like queer theory and being queer as performative, or gender as performative. And again, like, we're not saying that it's theatrics, right? We're not saying like, oh, you're just saying that how I am is just some play. It's like, no, what we're saying is, look, the ways we exist in the world are ways of creativity. We're creating being when we live and exist. And when we start to ask questions about, well, what does it mean to be a human? Like, maybe the way I feel I should be does not fall into what I've been told, right? And now you're starting to be in this imaginative, creative process, right? And, there's nothing negative or pejorative about creativity, right? Creativity is what we need to, like, understand our humanity, right? And so, and then when you start talking about creative, you start talking about processes, and you're just getting out of the static way of being, and you're being more dynamic. And that opens the way of existing, and that's important. But what type of social conditionings are we talking about, or the social norms that prevent us from imagining different ways of being or performing in ways that are outside established norms? What are these norms that we're talking about? Well, here we are on page 188, Eurocentrism. Europe as the center. That's a social norm, right? We're talking about that. Must therefore not be considered as a kind of prejudice, as some sort of poor judgment affecting some people but not others. It propagates an unconscious image of the world that is constantly reproduced through language and the practices of exploitation and exclusion that begin with European colonialism. The physical map of the world with Europe at its center may or may not be present to our minds when we use expressions such as Middle East, Western civilization, or another case in point, continental philosophy. When we utter terms such as the latter, we presuppose a continent that does not even have to be qualified or further identified because it is the continent through which we look at all others. Eurocentrism is a transformation of a specific continent, Europe, into a meta-continent through which we locate all other continents, Asia, Africa, the Americas, in the histories of which are all imbricated with European colonialism and Europe's own definition of itself as a space distinguished from its colonies. As Franz Fanon, she's just dropping the names, and with good intent, give credit where credit is due. That's a good hallmark of this book. Very aptly put it, Europe is literally the creation of the third world. This is a geopolitical space whose existence and self-definition came into being through colonialism, okay? And so when we ask the question, what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? The standard mainstream socially accepted answers are those that have been created by Eurocentrism and like European colonialism, right? Where Europe is the center, right? And that is restrictive, and it's like giving us a false sense of reality. Yeah, there's more to being than this specific idea of European culture, right? Which in and of itself is conflation and a misinterpretation of the continent of Europe, right? But it does sure help prop up a lot of powers, right? Like capitalism, like patriarchy, classism, racism, sexism, etc., etc. Right. This is page 206, the last paragraph. It is because when we say woman, we mean not just the creature inside the shell, but also the whole apparatus around her. That there have been forms of feminism unable to perceive those factors that usually do not vary in the European family. That is race and class. So we just keep reiterating what we're saying, thinking about womanhood only within this Eurocentric framework. Right? But let's start looking outside that framework, and we will discover there are many different ways of being a human being. There's many different ways of being a woman, right? And that frees us, that liberates us. But how does it liberate us? How does it free us? Well, let me read you page 227. This is the second paragraph of that page, the end of the fourth line. What does it mean to argue that not only there is no material wealth without labor of legions, but also that there is not a single thought or invention that is not common property, born of the past and the present? And again, we're talking about the interconnection, the interdependence of not only individuals, but like society. And, when we talk about things like wealth, and it's like, well, I earned this on my own. Well, did you really? No, you did not. Like, there are other people involved, and there are other things involved, and other institutions involved. And the same thing with thoughts, like ideas, right? Even those aren't unique to an individual, right? Because individuals are influenced by other individuals, and that together makes a thought and an idea, right? Within a monist ontology, it means emphasizing that thought and matter are not two different and independent substances, but simply two attributes of the same substance. Thus, in as much as material wealth is the result of circulation of bodies, so is intellectual richness, circulation and accumulation of modes in thinking that have aggregated and combined through the millennia. Thousands of inventors, known and unknown, have cooperated in the invention of each of the machines, which are now seen as a single result of a unique mind. Similarly, thousands of writers, poets, scholars, and thinkers have labored to produce and share the ideas that are deposited in our authored books. They have been upheld and nourished through life, both physically and mentally, by legions of workers and craftsmen of all sorts. They have drawn their motive force from the environment. The concept used by Peter Kropotkin, another famous anarchist philosopher, to summarize these ideas is that of mutual aid. He is one of the great thinkers of the concept of mutual aid. Not the only one, but he's one of the ones that propped up that idea, and like he's attributed to like how anarchists apply that idea. Although the notion may mistakenly suggest that wealth is produced by people's desire to help each other, the notion of mutual aid is not rooted in a philosophical anthropology, but rather in a philosophy of biology. As the subtitle of Kropotkin's major work points out, mutual aid is a factor of evolution. That is, a factor that recurs along the mutual struggle, but that in the long term is far more important. Although competition occurs, especially for success in the struggle for survival, mutual aid is a much more significant feature. So collaboration and collectivity is more of a driving force to life survival than domination and competition and exploitation. Okay, we're on page 228. This is the second paragraph, fourth line. We have never been individuals, properly speaking, since from the point of view of biology, every individual is a holobiont, an assemblage of the multicellular eukaryote, plus all of its symbionts, an ecological unit made by a host and all the species living around it and through it. Once we assume that perspective as opposed to that of a methodological individualism, which considers individuals as the starting point of philosophizing, then the symbiotic nature of life comes to the fore. And if it is true that, as Emma Goldman argues, anarchism is the teacher of the unity of all life, then we should conclude that symbiotic biology is anarchical in its spirit, if not in its letter. In that way, we can be free. We free ourselves from the onus and burden of individualism, right? And then we allow ourselves the freedom of trans-individuality, right? And interconnectedness and interdependence, because that's just how life really does operate. And when we embrace this, we can discover what it really means to be a human, right? Because a human is varied and diverse, but that diversity and that variety comes from the interdependence and interconnectivity of like an infinite amount of processes and individualities. Yeah, and so when we're talking about processes, we're not just talking about individuals, like just human individuals. We're also talking about all individuals, right? Let me share you this sentence here on page 260. This is the second paragraph, seventh line. Most have ignored the generative capacity of animals, plants, and other living beings, and thus not considered them, right? I skip down the 2 lines. Externalization of nature is one of the background conditions for the functioning of capitalism and must therefore be at the center of any contemporary rethinking of it, right? Again, like our oppressive systems like capitalism, right? Or like, hyper-capitalism or like late-stage capitalism, like really externalize nature. It's like, well, we got to dominate nature. We got to conform nature. We got to terraform nature, right? Ignoring the reality that nature is us. We are nature, and we depend on nature, right? So destroying nature literally destroys us, right? Completely ignored the generative power of plants and animals as also necessary for reproduction, right? I mean, we're just saying obvious things, but oftentimes our oppressive systems like capitalism condition us to ignore obvious things, right? And I skip down 9 lines. To put it bluntly, the environment is us, right? And thus beyond the inside-outside distinction, right? We're just like reiterating the book, what the book says, and the book is reiterating what we're saying, right? So let's return to like queer theory, right? And we're talking about the ecology of nature, right? And why is queer theory important in this discussion? And why is feminism important? And how is it part of anarchism, this anarchafeminism? And it's right here. This is page 282, third paragraph. We use the term queer ecology not simply to mean that anarchafeminism implies a form of ecology that questions the intersections of sex and nature. Much more broadly, this means a form of ecology that questions the boundaries between the discrete individualities, let alone the hierarchy between them. The term queer is here both an adjective and a verb, both a description of the queer nature of most of the living matter and an exhortation to queer the established hierarchies between different forms of being. Thus, queer ecology is not only the ecology thought and practiced by people who define themselves as queer, but a questioning of heteronormativity and cisnormativity that is part of a more general attempt at questioning all kinds of hierarchies. So this is now we're getting philosophical and we're broadening the idea, right? And this is how feminism can be applied more broadly, more generally. It's not just about gender equality. It's not just about women having equal rights than men, right? It's about liberating all human beings through the reality that there's variations in human being, right? There's ways of being that don't just fit in our social norms currently, right? Because our social norms are what are oppressing us, right? By propping a few people up via societal power, but leaving everybody else behind, and therefore leaving all of humanity behind. I skip down 6 lines. But questioning boundaries does not mean to eliminate distinctions, nor to give up individualities. Again, we're not saying like, well, people can just be anything, anytime, any place, any way they want to be. And okay, I mean that's, but a cow is not like a horse. There are distinctions that are made here, and their individuals do exist. It simply means conceiving them as trans individualities. Okay. Thus, whereas Tim Morton's insights that queer theory is ecology, just again crediting philosophers and thinkers where crediting is due. Good job. Queer theory is ecology is based on the notion of the mesh as a non-totalizable, open-ended concatenation of interrelations that blur and confound boundaries in practically any level. A trans individual philosophy frames queer ecology as one that examines boundaries and topples hierarchies while maintaining distinctions. The reason for this is easy to see. If ecological thinking means that boundaries are confounded at practically any level, and that we are thereby invited to become open, radically open forever without the possibility of closing again, then not only do we end up in a night where all cows equally look gray, but also open the door to the idea that anything is therefore up for grabs by anybody. This is not only a caricature of queer theory, but also a theoretical, political, dangerous move that potentially justifies violence against queer bodies. To question boundaries does not mean to state that one is open forever, right? And that's a common argument that's made that misinterprets queer theory, like the idea, like, look, I use these pronouns. It's like, well, if you can use those pronouns, then I can use the pronouns that you're using, because you're saying that you can define yourself as anything, so I can define myself as anything. It's like, wait a minute, we're not saying those things, right? We're saying that there are, just like we were saying before about the performativity being not like this, life is not a circus act. This is not saying the same thing. We're saying like the way we are is the way we perform, right? Our performance in life is who we are, right? And that should be acknowledged. So there's variance, right? But the variance can be distinguished. It isn't just like a sameness. It's that variance that makes the collective function, right? And it's the ability to distinguish is how the collective continues to function successfully, right? But the next page here, page 284, 4th line, how can we rethink the questioning of boundaries without ending up in a confusing mesh where everything is available for grabbing? The notion of transindividuality can here be very useful, precisely to point out that emphasizing the intra, supra, and even infra-dependence of every being does not mean abandoning individualities and distinctions. It means conceiving every individuality as transindividuality, as the result of a process of affecting and being affected that takes place at multiple levels, as one that individualizes, so to speak, in single concrete formations and in different spaces and times. It is a social ontology that enables us to perceive what happens beyond the threshold of somebody else's skin, but also one that does not invite us to violate that threshold if uninvited. Using that example of like a person, non-binary person says, well, I identify with they, them pronouns because that's how I feel. It's like, then a cisgendered person might say like, well, I mean, I don't think that's appropriate because, we shouldn't just call things just by feelings, right? I mean, if you can do that, then I can identify as they, them too, right? And so your whole argument gets destroyed. It's like, no, that's kind of a cheapening of the ideas, because you yourself, the cisgendered person, does not live in that reality, right? And then the other thing to consider is like the person who's non-gender conforming or non-binary does not eliminate the cisgendered person, right? That both realities exist, and both realities reiterate each other. It's just a denial of one's existence for the other. That's the problem, right? But by identifying these things, that is how we are able to validify them, right? And then we can, and then further validifying humanity in general, right? Because we acknowledge the variance of human being. But I skipped down 3 lines. Why is it so hard to perceive transindividuality before, after, and inside individuality? The individualist ideology that accompanies modernity is certainly a part of the answer. The conditions of modern life tend to separate us from all that would enable the perception of such transindividuality. The air we breathe is taken largely for granted, as plants only appear as accidental adornments in our cities, despite the fact that they literally constitute the breath of the world. There is a logic of alienation that governs capitalist modernity, which goes hand in hand with a logic of separation and classification. Okay? Right, so yeah, acknowledging the variance, right? And acknowledging the interdependentness, right? That's important. But we're conditioned based off of a capitalist society to look at the world as a zero-sum game and to like not acknowledge certain things where they're actually contributing tremendously to survivability of the very people who are not acknowledging them, right? So let's summarize this long-ass video, shall we? We'll do it via a quote. This is page 293. This is the 4th paragraph, 2nd line. Bodies in general, and women's bodies in particular, must not be considered as individuals, as fixed, unchangeable objects, but rather as processes. Women's bodies, like all bodies, are bodies in plural because they are processes constituted by mechanisms of effects and associations that occur at the inter, infra, and the supra-individual level. Our bodies come into being through an inter-individual encounter. They are shaped by supra-individual forces, such as their geographical locations, and they are made up by infra-individual bodies, such as the molecules we breathe, the hormones we absorb, or the images we process every day. A woman comes into being not just through interactions, but also through intra-actions. Properly speaking, we are not and never have been individuals. We are literally trans-individual processes, accidental sites of a process of becoming that takes place at different levels. We are relations, not substances, processes, not things. Only if we consider skin boundaries as the ultimate boundaries can we classify bodies as males and females. However, if we look beyond those boundaries and consider the totality of the cells comprising human bodies, we find out that 95% of them escape that dichotomy. Most living matter is actually queer. If we adopt this trans individual perspective, can we speak about womanhood outside of the modern colonial gender system, and thus use that very term in order to include all those who identify themselves as women, feminine women, masculine women, trans women, assign female at birth women, assign male at birth women, lesbian women, bisexual women, intersex women, cis women, asexual women, queer women, and so on and so forth. All the way up to ways of being woman that have not yet been invented, because another woman is not just possible, it has always already begun. And there you have it. Another woman is not just possible, it has also always already begun. And we're just focusing on woman and not man, although you can apply the same thing can be applied to man, not just because we're fixated on woman, but because the woman is what has been discriminated against or used to prop up powers in our society, because we live in a patriarchal society currently. And so by looking at the ones who are oppressed, women, we can understand the ways that humanity has been blocked from progressing, from understanding how vast our being is, how vast human being is, right? And it starts with an understanding of the variance of woman, because that is what is being blocked in our society, right? And then once you start to begin to understand that blockage, that discrimination, that oppression, then you can expand and say like, okay, now we can begin to understand what does it mean to be a man, right? And that all opens up all the floodgates as well. And then you can further go into all the other ways of being, gender non-conforming, non-binary, all the other listed types of being that the author shared in the book. So yeah, I really like this book. I think this book is honestly one of the best books I've ever read in my entire life. It's an amazing book. Check it out. Anarchafeminist by Chiara Bottici. Okay, maybe it might be in your local library. Maybe. I would just check it out, man. It's a great work, and I think this is where we need to take feminism. Right? Feminism needs to be pushed that way. This is how we progress the field of feminism, and as well as the field of anarchism. The methodology of anarchism, we need to take it that way. We need to push it in this direction, or just push it in these ways. Maybe you might not agree 100% with what the author is saying, but I do think this kind of rigor, this kind of drive, this kind of way of seeing how we move forward, that's what I'm talking about. Well, you've been watching the Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.